Okay. Well, hello everybody. Happy Sabbath. It's good to be with you. So this is part two of our study on abortion, contraception, and U.S. policies. So I wanted to give a brief review of the first part, and I'm going to just do a really quick review, not a lot of detail. So in the first part, abortion was frequently practiced between 1600s and 1900s. There were no abortion laws. Abortion was a regular part of life for women in the colonial days, and they had a common law that they picked up from England called quickening. And it's an archaic term that means fetal movement. In those days, women, excuse me, women cared for women. Men were not involved in the birthing process or even in anything involved in women's reproductive health issues, menstruals, cycles, things like that. In 1847, the AMA was formed by men who wanted to uplift the role of the doctor, give more authority to themselves. They were very high up elites who were educated and also knew legislative members. So they decided they wanted to make abortion illegal, that they were the ones who should determine when a woman could legally have an abortion. And they eventually phased out midwives. They basically took over women's reproductive health from women. And it was they that started a campaign against abortion, a nationwide campaign. Somebody from the East Coast would like the code for the meeting. Can somebody, Pam?
Yeah,
Six,
it's
six,
Pam that
seven,
wants
eight.
it.
Yeah, for Alyssa.
Okay, thanks.
Does she have it?
Oh, no, 678-375, something like that.
I'll have to look because I don't ever use it either. Maybe somebody else has it handy. But
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's right,
Okay.
Kathy.
Okay.
That's right.
Oh, right.
I never use it, so I
Wow, yeah,
on me.
I just thought I remembered. Okay. So anyway, they began a campaign nationwide against abortion. They were bad mouthing the women, calling them, basically quacks, and they were superstitious. They weren't educated. They weren't trained medically. And so, of course, this basically drove women underground because the laws in the states were now going anti-abortion. So that was just a very quick overview. Now we're going to talk about Anthony Comstock, which is now in the news these days, which is shockingly mind-blowing. Okay, so Anthony Comstock grew up in a very religious family, and it was also in the era of the Victorian period, which, if you remember, we talked about. It was very prudish. They were very strict. It was literally a sexual repression, whether you were married or not. And then there was a lot of shame, and women were looked down upon if they even thought about sexuality. So he lived in New York for a little while, and he saw all the sinful things going on, and he couldn't stand it. And he decided he wanted to cleanse New York of its smut. And he basically started an anti-vice campaign. And he would literally go to the bookstores, see where the pornographic or those kind of novels and books were sold, and then he would call the police and have the people arrested. And there was a form of you could call it a moral panic in the 1870s because of the proliferation of erotic materials and pamphlets and books. And this just added to Comstock's campaign against this. So he founded the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. And it was an organization that literally policed the morals of the public. And New York already had a law about obscene materials, but Comstock wasn't satisfied with just the state of New York. He wanted it to go nationwide, and he spent years lobbying Congress to pass a bill, and they did in 1873. So it basically prohibits any distribution of information about birth control and abortion, because at that time they didn't believe in birth control, because that meant then that you were having sex for fun. You weren't having it. And so that was totally immoral, even if you were married. So they did not condone extramarital sex. The restrictions didn't stop. You know, people were still having sex, but they were just being more secretive. And part of this Compact Act, which is we're seeing in some of the states like Florida, you can't even talk about it. Birth control or even your menstrual cycle, anything reproductive health, you cannot even talk about it. So they, of course, there's trampling the First Amendment right of free speech. Doctors and social reformers who provided women, can you say Margaret Sanger, were arrested. So anything that was mentioned in a newspaper or was passed in a pamphlet and it was found out who did it, they would go to jail and they could face $1,000 fine. So this law created a backlash, which they do. And it was just a century of criminalization of women's reproductive rights and controlled by the states and the government. By 1880, all states had laws that restrict abortion. Basically, the only exception was the life of the mother. But it also had an increased stigma around the abortion issue. By 1910, abortions are banned nationwide. Every state outrightly banned abortion at every stage. The only exception was to save the life of the mother. And let's keep in mind, too, that all these laws and all these decisions about a woman's reproductive health are being made by men. And then on top of that, the other men making decisions about a woman's reproductive health were the doctors, of which 95% were men. So around the 1910, part of the that connected with the abortion was the rate of immigration in the country. And so they were fearful of losing their white nationalism and the keeping their power. And so they figured if they had more abortion bans and laws against it, that it would be a way to get the upper class women to have more children, which you can realize now that's part of the eugenics that went on in that time period too. That's a whole nother story. So now we have all these laws that are banning abortion. What happens? Women go underground, and now they're getting illegal, unsafe abortions. And the consequences are women are dying and the deaths are increasing. And what changes this is that the media starts reporting on this in the 30s. This is in the 1930s now. And the decades just kept going, and it started getting the media attention. And as a result, Planned Parenthood put together, first of its kind, a conference on the abortion legalization. This has never been done. It was never a public thing. Remember, this is stigma. This is immoral. This is not what you talk about, right? Nobody talks about these things. And here is now the first open discussion and conference bringing together doctors and lawmakers, lay people, that to look at this and now reconsider, what can we do? And it's interesting that in that first conference, there were doctors who would publicly call for abortion reform, unheard of, which is a nice switch from back in the 1800s when they were controlling everything. So that's 1955, that association. In 1957, let me step back a little bit. Margaret Sanger opened up.
I keep over by your
1916, sorry.
That's
And so she was fighting Comstock laws, and she couldn't find any scientists that would work with them and that were connected with universities or corporations, and even pharmaceutical companies weren't interested because, you know, it's not an issue. And so they persisted, and they did find a doctor who would work with them. And Catherine McCormick funded his lab so they could do the work. It's a good story, but I can't give you all the details. Long story short, they succeeded. This doctor submitted it to a pharmaceutical company. But in 1957, because this was like 40s and early 50s, this pharmaceutical company, instead of calling it a birth control pill, they called it a pill for menstrual disorders. And it was called Inovid. Within 2 years, 500,000 women were getting prescriptions for menstrual disorders because they were finding out that they weren't getting pregnant. And but the bad news is the Inovid, because it was the first one, they didn't know a lot about hormones. It had way too much dosage of hormones, and they were having really bad side effects. And that's with the blood clots, the strokes, and heart attacks. But years later, they did get that dealt with. So in 1960, the FDA approves the pill as a contraceptive. And of course, in thanks to Margaret Sanger and Catherine McCormick. Technically, any state that did not ban contraception, the pill was technically illegal because the lawsuit had not come up yet, which was in 1965. We'll get there. Now, the interesting thing when the pill came out was a double standard was quickly exhibited. none other than by the U.S. News and World Report, warned about sexual anarchy, that sex outside the marriage was bad, and conservatives and liberals agreed that women should not be promiscuous. However, in the late 1950s, condoms were freely available, and no one wrote an article about sexual anarchy and that men should not be promiscuous. So we see still in the mid 60s, and remember, we've got the women's rights movement going on. A lot of the laws and bans and repeals obviously did not happen in a vacuum. We're surrounded in this complex history of the movements that are fighting, the different events that are happening in history and in the United States. So there's a lot going on. One of the things that I remember hearing about this when I was first started, I don't remember what it was, but it was in the 1960s, 1962, because they were showing pictures of this on the news. And it was a medication to give women, pregnant women, when they were having pregnancy symptoms, problems like nausea, things like that. And it's called thalidomide. The problem is that they discovered later that it caused severe birth defects. So thousands of women now are going through this experience, and one woman who was a public figure, a TV host, I guess, I don't know what show it was, but anyway, she had taken it and she wanted an abortion, and she wasn't allowed to have an abortion in the United States. So she chronicled her journey through this process of why she needed an abortion. And it wasn't because she didn't want the baby, but she knew the baby was severely deformed. She ended up having to go to Sweden to get her abortion. And at the time, they figured through the polls, 52% of Americans supported her decision. So as tragic as it was, it did put another view in the social mindset of the nation, because at the time there was just no abortions, period. Unless you're going to die, you still have that baby. So this fallout actually brought greater support for abortion reform. So you can see this gradual societal change coming along. And like I said, we had the abortion activists, the social movements, and all of that's in the background, pushing this reform along through the nation. So in 1964, excuse me, an association for the study of abortion was formed. So from 1955, now we have 1964. Here's another one that's going to study abortion law. And they registered this group. It's called the ASA. Their focus was to study abortions and to create reform laws that would advance abortion procedure safely. And so the strategic move was to incrementally increase abortion access, but they, in the beginning, only advocated medically necessary abortions. So they're being pragmatic. They know what the mindset of the nation is, and if you push too hard, you're not going to get anywhere, which we know a lot of there's different activists and events in history where they had to be pragmatic to get to the principle that they wanted. Because many in that group wanted full legalization. So 1965. So remember in 1960, the pill is legalized. Well, in 1965, the Supreme Court approves contraception. This is Griswold versus Connecticut. And they approve a constitutional right that women can use, married women, that's it, married women can use contraception. Because the 14th Amendment, they've decided, can they have the right of privacy between married couples. It's a constitutional right. This overruled Comstock Act, but it wasn't until 1972 that single women could legally have a contraception, use contraception, and not be married. So progress is being made. So amidst all this, so we've got a lot of unhappy Christian, right? Very conservative Christians, not happy, seeing the writing on the wall. Because if you can have contraception, then, you know, they see it coming. So in 1966, there was something called the trial of the San Francisco Nine. And it was 9 well-respected doctors who were sued in California for performing abortions on women who had been exposed to measles, rubella. And it's a disease known to cause birth defects. The doctors were arrested and there was a trial. They were supported across the country from doctors everywhere, including 128 deans of medical schools. So this actually resulted in the first abortion reform measure in the United States, and California amended its prohibition on abortion to allow hospital committees, okay, they got some ground, but not all, to approve requests for abortion. So you can see the steps that how it's moving. And of course, you know, women didn't have rights. You still couldn't open up a checking account or have a credit card. So it's really it's like walking in mud to get these to get the country's mind to open up, to legislatures, all of that, to see why this is important. It's not just a medical issue. There's so many other tenets that are connected to this as far as women making choices and what they're, when and how many children they have, etc. So by 1969, 49 states had criminalized abortion, and it was considered a felony crime. I mean, they were not messing around. So then in the same year, another organization is founded, and it's called the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. And it was the first national group created solely to campaign for the legalization of abortion. 1969, where are we? We're right in the second wave feminism. And it's having an effect. The pressures are coming on society to make these changes. So it did take people seeing that the personal is political, and people were pushing for it in their own communities, in their own states. Legislatures were lobbied. States were taking action. 4 states actually legalized abortion. They added additional exceptions. Instead of it being just for the mother's life, They added that if the pregnancy would would be dangerous for the physical or mental health of a patient, they then included fetal abnormalities, and then they added also rape or incestuous rape. So there was change happening, and it was dotted around the United States. During the late 60s is when the moral majority joined in to the anti-abortion campaign, because that would be a distraction from their racist plans after the passage of Brown versus Board of Education. Just a little note there. There is a very large group of anti-abortionists that are getting organized, just like the pro-abortion groups are. And that's a whole nother study too, because it's complex, there's layers. So 1970, New York legalizes abortion. 2/3 of their patients came from out of state because they were still outlawed. Others, they did not create you have to be a resident to come, so that was really helpful. So 1973, Roe v. Wade, landmark decision, ruled that the due process clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution gives a right to an abortion. It's an all-male justices. It was 7-2. So women had the right to privacy. The court recognized for the first time that the constitutional right to privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision of whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Again, more progress is being made. All 50 states are now protected. Women are protected in all 50 states for having abortion services. And it set a legal precedent. Now, because of the 14th Amendment, in there it mentions the word person. And the justices had said that person does not include an unborn person. Keep that in your mind. This is 1973. What did the anti-abortionists, what was their argument? Their argument was fetal personhood, that the baby was a person. And that's what they lost in the court. One of the things that happened 1 week after the passage of Roe v. Wade was a legislator filed a bill of the Human Life Act 1 week after Roe v. Wade. It failed, but it shows you the backlash. I mean, this battle.
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat that? 1 week
So
after?
1 week after Roe v. Wade was passed, a legislator in Maryland proposed a bill called the Human Life Act.
Okay.
And it failed, but it shows you that there was an immediate reaction and plans were already being made to overturn Roe. And it's interesting that in 1973, it's about fetal personhood.
Mm-hmm.
So 1976, the Hyde Amendment is passed in the Congress. It is a discriminatory and racist policy that prohibits federal dollars to be used for abortions, like Medicaid, and except the certain exceptions of rape and mother's health. It was created by a man named Henry Hyde, and I want to read a quote of his. He said, "I would certainly like to prevent, if I could legally, anybody having an abortion. A rich woman, a middle-class woman, or a poor woman. But unfortunately, the only vehicle available is the Medicaid bill, which of course affects the poor the most. The Black, the Latino, LGBTQ communities, people who already face barriers for care and economic opportunity." Pardon? Okay. So some states did allow money to be used for abortions, but it was using state funds. They were not allowed to use the federal funds. In 2021, the Biden-Harris administration did not include the Hyde Amendment in its presidential budget. And the next thing I picked up on was in 1984, Ronald Reagan is president, and he introduced something called the Mexico City policy. It was actually given the name the Global Gag Order because it prevented foreign organizations from receiving US dollars for health aid if they provided information on or referrals to abortion. So let's say you have foreign countries, they want health aid help financially. And then there's this law, this gag order that says, okay, we'll give you money, but you cannot refer anyone to an abortion. You cannot even mention the topic. And you can't even tell them where to go. Just no mention of it. So this policy is a yo-yo. It's like every president that comes in, it's either continues to be implemented or it's not, depending on, and generally it's Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, that the policy goes up and down. When Trump was in presidency, he not only reinstated it, but he expanded it to make it even more harmful. And I didn't look into it to get any more details, but I'm not surprised that that's what he would do. So now we have all these steps. We're making baby steps of progress towards abortion reform, women's rights, minority rights, LGBTQ rights. So the nation's mindset, ideology is changing in some of the people. In 1992, there was a Supreme Court case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So that case confirmed the Constitution protects the right to an abortion. But it did one thing. It did take a jab at Roe v. Wade. Didn't ban abortions. They created a framework called the undue burden. And it's laws that would restrict abortions, that the access to an abortion would be made more difficult. And so they could pass laws that say, okay, you got to wait 24 hours. Mandatory ultrasounds. blood work, all these different things. You have to have your clinic now has to be as quality as a hospital. And so the battle was back and forth trying to show that's an undue burden. And it was on the providers of abortion that they had to prove what these legislators were doing was an undue burden. So they were just throwing spaghetti on the wall to see what would stick. And they would eventually end up in Supreme Court also. So basically, that's when we see the laws that are now putting obstacles in a woman's ability to get abortion. The abortion is still legal, but now the providers are having to jump through a lot of hoops. So they created something, and in that thing came out a term, an acronym called TRAP, and it's Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers. And states would pass hundreds of expensive and burdensome restrictions just to test the constitutional limits of Roe v. Wade. I don't know how many would remember, but after Roe v. Wade, there were a lot of religious protests. But do you remember all the violence? I mean, they were bombing clinics. They were shooting and killing doctors. I mean, it was, and anybody who was in that clinic would die. And so it was very extreme. And there was a woman who wrote a book. Her name is Laura Briggs. How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics, from welfare reform to foreclosure to Trump. And she says, first they started bombing clinics and murdering providers, and this formed the nucleus of the alt-right that we're now living with as white. So it's just, they're not violent like that anymore. They just stand outside the clinic before it was overturned and do all their protesting in front of the clinic, trying to make the woman feel very bad.
Yeah, Susan put in the chat about, because I remember reading this too, where they, the churches, I'll read it so I get it right. When seeking abortions during the time it was still legal, some places posed as abortion centers. So I remember reading about that, but they were church-run places that tried to guilt the women through scriptures into having the baby.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. Does anybody else have any comments too? I'm just rolling on.
No, you're fine. I was just thinking, I don't think you touched this. I can't remember if you said this, but they also put all kinds of building restrictions, set up building codes to, so they would say that the hallway has to be so many feet wide, and so that they made it impossible or very expensive for abortion clinics to remain functional.
Yes, yes, that's true. So another Supreme Court case was in 2007, and they upheld that they upheld a federal ban on something called well, let me put it this way. There's a procedure called dilation and extraction. The court ruled that the ban on the procedure was constitutional because that's when they got the term, the opposers to abortion called it a partial birth abortion. It is a procedure that leads to fewer complications for pregnant people, but this is just another weakening. It's also something they would do when you have a miscarriage. But if the fetus dies, then they usually have to use that procedure, but now that's been banned. So there's just another a weakening of Roe. So in 2010, President Obama got the Affordable Care Act passed. And it was great. A lot of people who never could get insurance, health insurance, were now covered. So in 2012, the Department of Health and Services presented guidelines, and they stated that companies with 50 or more employees, and they sponsored health insurance within their company, were required now to offer the 14 types of contraception to their employees, and it was to be free. Oh, a flurry of lawsuits were filed. Dozens and dozens of corporations were totally against it. And the one that we're already was in 2014, and that's Hobby Lobby. That's an interesting court case. If you have time, you want to get a little more detail on it. But so the premise was that Hobby Lobby, even though they're a for-profit corporation, they are closely held corporation. They're not public, and they have an objection to certain contraceptive methods because, according to their religious belief, life begins at conception, and they believe that these contraceptive actually induced abortion, and they were incorrect. The science proves otherwise. So these corporations, Hobby Lobby, filed a lawsuit. There was others. Hobby Lobby wasn't the only one. But they filed lawsuits under the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration that Bill Clinton signed. And it's also about the First Amendment, the free exercise clause of a religion. So they took that law and said, hold on, my religious beliefs are just as important as nonprofit corporations who were exempt from having to provide contraception. And so therefore, we have the right to not provide contraception to the employees. And their other argument was, can go other states to get free contraception, so there's no due burden. So the law in 1993 does not define person. So in this 2014 case, the Supreme Court, turned to the dictionary of 1871. I didn't know that even existed. And it's a way to identify certain words that are found in federal law, and that they would go with that definition unless the context indicates otherwise. So 5 out of 9 justices agreed with the dictionary that the definition of persons included corporations within the context of the religious freedom. So that's how Hobby Lobby got out of having to, and they have, I think, over 500 stores, and I can't remember how many, hundreds of thousands of women. So they were not eligible for this contraception. So there was a man, he wrote in the Journal of Ethics for the American Medical Association. It was very prophetic, so I'm going to read that. His name is Adam Sonfield. He's actually the publisher of the journal. He said the religious exemptions could potentially be applied to prevent organizations from providing necessary coverage for numerous other healthcare services. I thought LGBTQ right away, right? And that's, where we're going. But so they're going after the abortion rights again. 2016, another Supreme Court case from the state of Texas, and they had two very strong abortion restrictions that would involve the undue burden. They made it, clinics had to have hospital privileges so that if there was an emergency, that they could then transport the woman to the hospital. And I don't know all the details on how hard it is to get hospital privileges or if they're expensive, whatever it is, but it was ruled that that was an undue burden to access safe, legal abortion. Plus, it would shut down almost every clinic in the state of Texas. So it must be really expensive. 2016, there's a quote from Trump before he was elected. He said, people who had abortions should be punished. And he goes, I promise to appoint Supreme Court justices to automatically overturn Roe. And so we did. 2020. Louisiana struck down a medically unnecessary law that was identical to the one back in up here in 2016. The law would have made abortion virtually impossible in Louisiana. This was RBG's last court case that she dissented on. And of course, then when she died, Amy Coney Barrett was replaced. So we see an increase of now these undue burdens, restrictions coming on access to abortion. They're not trying to ban it outright yet, but they are making these difficulties for access, and that will play a big role later on in the study. So Texas 2021, you may remember they implemented that law called SB 8, 6 weeks of pregnancy. The American Medical Association did denounce that law. They also had vigilante type, where anybody who helps, aids, or abets a woman can be put in jail, and then a bounty could be paid to the person who reported them. So it was in December 2021 that the Supreme Court heard oral arguments for Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs-Jackson Women's Health Organization. And in that case, it was a Mississippi ban on abortion at 15 weeks, which was a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade. They asked the court for abortion bans on pre-viability, which is generally before, I think, 20 weeks, maybe 24 weeks. But they also asked the Supreme Court to overturn Roe and Casey, which was the case from 1992. They wanted to overturn entirely. And so that started in December of 2021. In May 2022 came the leak of the Supreme Court's decision. And then June of 2022, on the 24th, was when it was overruled. So they eliminated a federal constitutional right for women's reproductive health decisions. It had been around 50 years, but from the beginning, as they looked back, they see it was flawed. It did say people had the right to abortion, but it never protected people's access to abortion. And you can see that's exactly what the anti-abortion movement people would go for, was the access. Let's make it more difficult. And it's just repeating the pattern. Jim Crow laws, voting suppression laws. Anytime there's a law that is for equality and for equity, the backlash will always chip away and make restrictions to make things more difficult, more challenging, more expensive, and just basically wear you down. And it's a pattern that's repeated. Lots of states passed laws making getting abortion nearly impossible. More bans came in 2023. There were a lot of trigger laws. I don't know if you've heard of those. A lot of states had their laws already made with a trigger that says once Roe v. Wade is overturned, then this law will automatically go into effect. So for years, the anti-abortionists were seeking and promising and pushing for these judges and justices that were hostile to abortion. They were able to manipulate the nomination rules, as we saw with Mitch McConnell not allowing Obama to appoint justices. That played a huge role. So now the Supreme Court is dominated by justices who are hostile to abortion rights. And as a result, now I think 1 in 3 women live in states that do not provide abortion. It's not even accessible. There is one little side road I'd like to take. It's on, I didn't send you a picture of this, but hold on. All right. Any thoughts before I take this side road on abortion and U.S. policy, the culture, the society, the legalized the protests, the violence? Any thoughts, comments? More information?
Yes, Kathy, this morning, you know, when you peruse the morning mail that comes in your email, there was an article from the 19th showing how many women now in the red states are being actually turned away if they're pregnant. I mean, just turned away. They will not even treat them. And because of the Susie's Bible study and the studying we've been doing to try and reread the Bible in a small group that I meet with during the week, I was thinking about Joseph and Mary, and in relation to this differently, right, than the way we had always kind of seen that story. And I was thinking about how everyone was turning them away when she was ready to give birth to Jesus. and the similarity in that, you know, of what they're doing now, turning away the very most vulnerable. I just saw it different than I had ever thought about it before.
Thank you, Susan. Anyone else? Okay, so I'm going to turn my board around for a kind of a sub-study within this study of contraception and abortion, and it is connected with it because it's in the news today. So just give me a second. Sorry.
And you do have a picture or you don't yet?
I don't have a picture of this, but I can send it. I can do one real quick. I wasn't sure if I was going to have enough time. Okay, I sent it to you, Elaine.
Okay.
So in 1973, the Human Life Act was about fetal personhood. That was the argument in that 73 case that the anti-abortionists were arguing. So one of the judges in the 1973 decision, Harry Blackmun, in his majority opinion in passing Roe v. Wade, made this comment. If this suggestion of personhood is established, because that was the argument the anti-abortionists were going for, that a person in the 14th Amendment includes the unborn. If this suggestion of personhood is established, Roe's case, of course, collapses. For the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. And that's when this Maryland congressman proposed the Human Life Amendment. And that was 7 days later, a week after the decision, and over 40 decades or so, over 330 versions of this Human Life Amendment was proposed or introduced. So in 1983, the Senate holds a historic vote on the floor for the Human Life Amendment. So you go from 1973 to 1983, 10 years later, now it's on the Senate floor. It fails by a wide margin. It was then that the personhood proponents shifted their strategy to changing the laws state by state. This is a strategy that the suffragettes used because you can't beat, the big Congress, so you need to break it down. So you can see how both sides use the same methodology. And there's a time to be practical and there's a time to hold to your principles. So that's what they did. They started going state by state. The first state was Minnesota in 1986. And by 2014, 38 states had similar statutes, and it was a fetal homicide law. And I haven't checked how many states have it now, but I'm sure it's probably almost all of them, at least red. So in 2004, they managed to get a Congress to pass the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. It's the first federal law making it a crime to harm or kill a fetus during an act of violence against the mother. It covers only federal crimes. And this, of course, triggered a lot of state laws. The So if someone hurts a pregnant woman and the baby dies, then they're now homicide of two people, not just one. So in 2008, a young woman named Christy Burton, she was a college student in Colorado, and she was working for Amendment 48, and it was groundbreaking in that it defined a constitutional protected person as, quote, any human being from the moment of fertilization. And it got onto the state ballot, but the voters rejected it 3-1. But her group, Personhood USA, is born. So now here's this first organized group that is new, and they're militant in their desire to have this passage made around the nation. So in 2011, Mississippi made a law that said fertilized eggs equals a person. And they put it on their ballot, and it was a law to try and challenge Roe v. Wade, because that's what everybody does, whether you're pro or anti. You want to challenge that law that you disagree with. So that wording would then outlaw birth control, and it would challenge Roe v. Wade, and the voters, 58%, rejected it. So that's 2011. 2014, persecution begins. Tennessee becomes the first state to enact a law that specifically allows prosecution of pregnant people who use drugs, with a penalty of up to 15 years in prison. So no drug counseling, nothing to help her to become drug-free and able to care for her child, but just to, and this is still happening, especially in the South. Women are thrown in jail because a law, I don't remember when it passed, and I don't know if I put it in here, but generally when women came in to give birth, they were not checked for drugs. There was no drug tests, and then eventually it became automatic, but I don't remember when that happened. 2014, the National Personhood Alliance was formed. It was an offshoot of the Georgia Right to Life. It's a Christ-centered, biblically informed, dedicated to nonviolent advancement of the recognition and protection of the God-given, inalienable right to life of all innocent human beings as legal persons at every stage of their biological development. So now this is a nationwide, where the one back in 2008 was just a statewide movement. 2018, Alabama adds a clause to the Constitution about personhood. 2021, Mississippi attempts for a second time to amend the state constitution with the personhood amendment. No exceptions allowed. Criminalization of murder to the preborn. And then that same year, Rand Paul proposes a national personhood bill to the Congress. And then in 2024, Alabama Supreme Court, using the 2018 amendment about fertilized eggs are persons, ruled that frozen embryos created in IV are children, and people can be held liable for destroying them.
Kathy?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to say this, but that law, when you think about it, them claiming, you know, and how you laid out this history showing that that was left there so that they could use this reasoning so that even an embryo or an egg now is a life. What about men's sperm? You know, when you think about it, men have thousands and thousands of sperm that get released, and most of those all die. Only one actually will come in contact with the egg to give way for life. But you don't see them saying that the sperm is life, and with the severe implications that they are drawing from the egg being already life. It's just so perverted. I don't know if I'm making sense what I'm trying to say, but
So they're saying the fertilized egg is life.
yes, but I think they're even having trouble, like women who have frozen their eggs for later down the line, right? Say they want to plan to have their pregnancy later. Now they can't destroy those eggs because they're claiming that those eggs are life. So
there's
it's just opening so many legal problems with the whole reasoning. Go ahead, Donna.
that mindset, Susan, that you're talking about. The Jewish religion has a very interesting way of looking at this issue, mainstream Judaism and liberal Judaism. They see the concept of abortion, of course, they're for abortion. And they even can back it up with scripture. And I think some things in the Tanakh, I think it's the Tanakh, that book where they have all that the rabbis have written all these rules and regulations and things. So they say that they don't consider a life personhood up until the point where you see the head coming out of the womb, the vagina. Once you see that head, at that point, that child has now gotten the breath of life, which they call the nefesh. The breath of life breathe into them, and now that child becomes a living soul. And until the personhood has a living soul, they are not considered a person. So if it was in the 9th month, but the head still has not entered out of the vaginal, you can still have an abortion, even in the 9th month. As long as that head, you're not seeing the head come out. Once you see that head coming out, now that child has been given the breath of life from God. And at that point, this is their mindset, God has now acknowledged that person as a living soul. So with that mindset, the woman that is actually carrying the fetus has more clout with God as a living soul than the fetus itself.
Amen, Donna. And I was thinking of crowning.
Yes.
That gives a whole new meaning to crowning.
Yes.
Even we think of the, right?
Even they consider the animals, when the animals are, once they come out of the birthing canal, come out, then God has breathed life into that animal, and now that animal is now a living soul, and God has recognized that animal as a living soul. Isn't that interesting? I think it's really interesting. So, this mindset about personhood at conception, well, that's highly questionable. I don't even know where they get that.
It's a very strong religious belief. Some of my closest friends are so disappointed that I'm not opposed to women having abortions, that they have the right. And she goes, "Well, Kathy, that's murder." And I knew right then and there I couldn't go anywhere with her. She's very strong religious.
I actually did a little research on that particular, I think they use scripture from Exodus. They use scripture, it's in the New Testament, but they also have that Tanakh where the rabbis have actually, they've actually dealt with this issue. They've dealt with abortion, and they specifically say that women have the right up until this point to have an abortion, and that a man doesn't have a right to make that decision. Not the father nor the husband has a right to over, it's just, it's kind of amazing, really.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that we see how rights are not secure because they can be changed. And I think there was something, Elder Parmenter said something about if you think something's secure and safe, don't, you'll be surprised because, I mean, 50 years, Roe v. Wade, it's been around 50 years at that time. And nobody really thought it would go anywhere, but it just shows that, yeah, state can take those rights anytime they want.
Right.
Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, I'll go ahead and close in prayer. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kathy.
Holy God, we praise you and thank you for this opportunity to gather, to study, to understand history within context of prophecy, equality, and equity. Lord, continue to bless us as we study, and we ask for a continued blessing on this Sabbath day. We praise you and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.